So anyway, I was all of 24, 25. My name is Evan Weiner, and I was working with WNEW Radio. Remember WNEW Radio? So I was working. Make Believe Ballroom. William B. Williams, right? Make Believe Ballroom.
Was that all the news all the time?
I did news. I was doing news for them at the time, and maybe I should just sit and we'll have a little get together here as opposed to me standing up and all. So yeah, I was with WNEW, and this is 1980. This is January of 1980, and Ronald Reagan is running for president, and he's not doing very well at that point. George H.W. Bush is doing a little better than him in the polls. And anyway, so I interviewed him. I was up in Bear Mountain, January of 1980, and I spent a half hour with him.
Where's Bear Mountain?
Bear Mountain over in Orange County, across the river.
I'm from Massachusetts.
Oh, you're from Massachusetts. Anyway, so
I have a house.
yeah. Oh, Bear Mountain. You couldn't get there this summer because it was flooded out.
I know.
So.
That's why I'm here.
Oh, okay. So anyway, so I interviewed him in January 1980, and at that point, nobody ever thought he was going to be president. They thought somebody else would be the Republican frontrunner, and he won the presidency. And there he is with Ronald Reagan and his wife Nancy. One of the other things that I did in 1980, if this thing is ever working correctly, which it should, was I was at the Democratic National Convention.
Can you let my husband sit there?
What do you want? You want to sit there?
He wants to sit there.
Oh, he wants to sit there? That's fine. So anyway, I was at the Democratic National Convention where I saw Ted Kennedy give this great speech I don't remember. But anyway, I was there, and this is my background, right? I was there, and I was part of the 1980 presidential campaign. Actually, it was more so the New York State Senate race with Alphonse D'Amato and Liz Holtzman and a few others who were initially in the race as well, Carol Bellamy. So I was there. I covered the hostages coming back from Iran, and I'll get into that in a few minutes. Reagan, well, there was an assassination attempt on his life with John Hinckley. The Patco strike, the air traffic controllers union was busted. Anwar Sadat was killed. There was martial law in Poland. Pope John Paul II was shot. There was a lot of assassination attempts that year. Sandra Day O'Connor became the first woman to serve on the Supreme Court. The shuttle Columbia went up. AIDS, the AIDS crisis begins, at least the AIDS crisis as we know it, although researchers tracked it back prior to 1981. I am right there. You can see my microphone, and you can see the side of my head right there. Muhammad Ali called it quits. The Raiders of the Lost Ark, how many of you saw that movie? You like it?
Yes.
Yeah, well, that came out that year. And these two got married, Charles and Diana. And before she was my wife, before she was my girlfriend, before I met my wife, she was in England that summer, and she picked up that souvenir, which sits in my house 42 years later. MTV, anybody watch MTV back in the day? Well, MTV started.
My kids had it on.
All the time, when they used to play music.
Mine too.
Yeah, when they used to play music. But anyway, we're going to start here early January 1981. And the hostages are released from Iran. And they go to Stewart Air Force Base in Newburgh. And it was me, and it was Bob Lemulak. And we're working for the two radio stations in Rockland County across the river, neither of which functions today as they did then. Bob was with WRKL Radio. I was with WGRC Radio. I was the news director, so I pulled rank. We find out that the hostages are coming back from Iran. They're going to arrive at Newburgh at Stewart Air Force Base. And I decided I'm going to go because I was the boss. I was a 24-year-old news director, and Bob's assigned to go up there. So the first thing that we do is we have to go to West Point, and we have to pick up credentials to go to see the hostages return in Newburgh. And Bob and I decided, hey, you know what? Neither one of us is making money. Well, let's take one car. This way we'll save on gas. And also, you know what? If you miss something or I miss something and I got it or you got it, we'll share it, because that's what we used to do back in the day, even though our bosses didn't want to know that we would share information. So we did. We worked together. So we get up to West Point, and we walk into Thayer Hall. And we're online waiting for our credentials. You know, we show our credentials, they give us military credentials, and we have to go on buses. And Bob and I decide we're going to split up. We're going to go, either he's going to go on that bus, I'm going to go on the other bus, simply because if one of the buses break down, well, you know, the other guy is covering for us, and we'll both have the story. So we get up to West Point, we get on the bus, and there was this crew-cutted guy with the earphone in right here saying, well, you're not talking to any of the returning hostages. All you're going to do is see them go on the bus. Okay, that kind of ruins the story, because we were hoping to talk to one of the returning hostages. But anyway, so we decided, okay, plan B. What's plan B? Well, we're going to talk to the people who are there near the Air Force Base, and we'll ask their reaction. Well, initially we were hoping to go into this hall because it was about 2 degrees. It's January, it's about 2 degrees, and the wind is blowing in from Canada, that northwest wind. So it's just cutting right through you. And Bob and I we catch up with one another on the buses, and we decide, well, you know, let's do our plan, because we don't need to help each other out. He can get his people, and I can get my people. And that's how we covered the returning hostages. We saw the bus going by, they waved to us, and we waved to them, and that was my experience as welcome back to freedom as the hostages came back. On November the 4th, 1979, the Iranian militants stormed the United States Embassy in Tehran, and they took approximately 70 Americans captive. All because of this. Shah of Iran. Shah got very sick, and he fled from Iran early in 1979, and he ends up in the United States, and the Iranians are really, really unhappy that Americans are giving the Shah treatment for his cancer. Anyway, he begins his reign in 1941. He succeeded his father, Reza Khan, for the throne. 1953, there's a power struggle with the Prime Minister. The Shah gains support to prevent nationalization of Iran's oil industry. In return, he tells the United States, you can have all the oil that you want, and you just give us aid. And he would get aid from 8 presidents. Now, it isn't as simple as I've laid it out. The United States and Britain literally overthrew the Iranian Prime Minister in 1953, led by Theodore Roosevelt's grandson, Kermit Roosevelt Jr. So the Iranian Revolution roots are in 1953. It's all because of the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company coup, where the United States, the Dulles brothers, England decide, hey, you know what, the Iranians, they want to become their own country. They want their own independence. We can't have that. In March of 1951, Mohammad Magazine presents the idea of nationalization of the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company to the Iranian Parliament, and it is eventually approved by the Iranian Parliament, and Moghazeh is elected as Iran's new prime minister. In Moghazeh, and he's out of the picture soon. In May of '51, Britain imposes an embargo on Iranian oil, and also bans the exportation of goods to Iran in retaliation. Britain also mobilizes their navy in a show of force. In June of 1951, the United States, under the President Harry Truman, tries to mediate the situation between Iran and Britain diplomatically, while Britain decides to take legal action against Iran in the International Court of Justice. In July 1951, the International Court of Justice rules that the conflict could not be resolved by the ICJ. It was a problem between a private company, the oil company, and the Iranian government. Treaties didn't matter right there. And there is the prime minister who basically was trying to keep his oil and get money from the oil as opposed to giving it to Britain. 1952, Iran decides to sever diplomatic relationship with Great Britain. There is a failed coup attempt against him, and the Shah, or the guy who would eventually be the Shah, would flee Iran. Over the course of 4 days in August of 1953, Kermit Roosevelt Jr. decides not only to have one coup, but let's have two coups. Because, you know, double your pleasure, right? Double your fun, right? So he's trying to destabilize the government, and he does succeed. The prime minister was a popular figure in Iran. He introduced a range of social and economic policies, the most significant being the nationalization of the Iranian oil industry. Now, Great Britain had controlled the Iranian oil industry for decades, and that was his big mistake. I'm taking this away from you and the Brits and the Americans. Eisenhower, Dulles brothers, the people in Britain say, no, 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 you're not doing this. We're getting rid of you. And they did. Eisenhower also, Dwight Eisenhower, the President of the United States, decided he's going to be tough on communism. Well, he's going to pick on Iran because Iran actually is speaking to Stalin and the Soviet Union, and that was enough to knock off the Iranian government. And here's the Shah, and here's Dwight Eisenhower, 1953, enjoying each other's company. The coup. The American CIA and the British Secret Intelligence Service funded and led a covert operation to depose the Prime Minister with the help of forces loyal to the government. How many of you remember Ajax, the laundry detergent, stronger than dirt? Ajax, right? This thing is called Operation Ajax. I'm not sure if it was named after the cleaner or they just said, hey, it sounds like a good name.
Well, I think Ajax was a mythological figure.
Yes, that too. But I know it as a but I know it as a cleaning detergent. Ajax, stronger than dirt. Anyway, Operation Ajax depended on orders signed by the Shah. Get rid of the Prime Minister, replace him with a general by the name of Fazlazza Zahardi. A choice that by the way, that the Americans and the Brits actually liked. They liked this guy. Nixon would go to, some of you know I knew Richard Nixon. Some of you know that. I've told you the stories about how I got to know him in 1985. Well, you know, Nixon's vice president. Vice president really doesn't do all that much. In fact, Nixon, during the 1950s, his vice president had so much spare time that he went to see Washington Senators baseball games. And my old friend, the late Bob Wolf at WRC in Washington, said to him one day, you know a lot about baseball, why don't you sit in and we'll do the broadcast together? And he did about 20 broadcasts. The Vice President of the United States had nothing better to do than to do Washington Senators baseball games as a color commentator on radio. Eisenhower didn't trust him with anything, so he sends him to Iran. It's December 7th, and the Vice President, Richard Nixon, goes to Iran, and that sparks several days of riots in reaction to the August 19th overthrow of the government. 3 students are shot dead by police in Tehran.
Our students or their students?
Their students, Iranians. Here is the Shah with John Kennedy in 1963. In 1963, he launched his White Revolution, a broad government program that included land reform, infrastructure development, voting rights for women. Do you know that Switzerland didn't allow women to vote until 1971?
Yeah.
Did you know that?
Yes.
Iran had, you knew that. Iran had rights for women could vote in Iran in 1963. Switzerland said no until 1971. Anyway, the infrastructure development, the reduction of the military, of illiteracy. Although the programs were applauded by many in Iran, Islamic leaders were critical. What they saw was the westernization of Iran. They liked Hollywood movies. They liked cowboy shows on TV, and the clerics didn't like it. Especially this guy, Ayatollah Khomeini. And he's opening his mouth, he is running his mouth. Ruhollah Khomeini, and in Khomeini. And he was a cleric. He was a Shiite cleric. And he was very vocal. He criticized the Shah, called for the overthrow of the Shah, and the establishment of the Islamic State did the same. He's arrested in 1963. He's a political enemy. He's exiled. He goes from Iran to Iraq on November 4th, 1964, and he begins a radio show there. And the radio show advocates for the overthrow of the Iranian government. And the radio messages resonated with Iranians. He cultivated a large, well, if you're in Iraq, radio goes into
I
Iran.
don't mean that, I mean, how could you overthrow another government?
Well, he wanted to. He's an Iranian citizen. He wanted to overthrow the government. His radio messages resonated with Iranians. He had a large following in exile, established a strong, influential network that positioned him to play a commanding role in the overthrow of the Shah. And there is the Shah, and there is his wife in 1979. Between 1963 and 1979, the Shah spent billions of dollars, oil dollars, on military weapons, which he got from the United States. The real price of the military strength was the loss of popular support. Unable to sustain economic progress and unwilling to expand democratic freedoms, the Shah's regime collapsed into a revolution. On January 16, 1979, the Shah fled Iran, never to return.
Where did he end up?
Well, that causes the problem. Opposition to the Shah's policies were more pronounced in the 1970s when the world monetary instability and fluctuations in Western oil consumption seriously threatened the country's economic policies, or the economy, still directed in large part toward high-cost projects and programs. A decade of extraordinary economic growth, heavy spending, and a boom in oil prices led to high inflation and stagnation of Iranians' buying powers and the standard of living. Repression increased in the 1970s. Outlets for political participation were minimal. Opposing parties such as the National Front, a loose coalition of nationalist clerics, non-communist left-wing parties, and the pro-Soviet party and massive parties were marginalized or outlawed. Social and political protests were often met with censorship, surveillance, harassment, illegal detention, and torture was common. This is Iran in the late 1970s. The protests and the police tried to put down the protests.
Where was the United States?
This is what leads to the hostage taking. The Iranian Revolution started on January 7, 1978. An article entitled "Iran and Red and Black Colonization" appeared in the National Daily newspaper, written under the pseudonym by a government agent. It denounced Khomeini as a British agent, a mad Indian poet conspiring to sell out Iran for neo-colonialists and communists. Religious seminary students in the city of Qom, angered over the insult to Khomeini, clashed with police. Protests continued throughout the year. General strikes started in September. Jimmy Carter and America and American policymakers have no idea what to do. On September 8, 1978, the Shah's security force fired on large groups of demonstrators, killing hundreds, wounding thousands. 2 months later, thousands took to the streets of Tehran, rioting and destroying symbols of westernization such as banks and liquor stores. Khomeini called for the Shah's immediate overthrow. And on December 11, 1978, a group of soldiers mutinied and attacked the Shah's security officers. With that, the Shah's regime collapsed. The Shah fled.
To where?
Now he goes to Egypt. Saddam Hussein, well, you know what? He's sick of the Ayatollah. Saddam Hussein is our friend, America's friend at this point. The Iraqi ruler, Saddam Hussein, forced Khomeini to leave Iran on October 6, 1978. Khomeini would end up in Paris, a Parisian suburb. From there, his supporters relayed his tape-recorded messages to an increasingly aroused Iranian population, and massive demonstrations and strikes and civil unrest start in late 1978, and the Shah is out of there by January 16, 1979. Yes?
Where is Kermit?
Who?
Roosevelt Kermit.
Oh, he's gone. He's long gone. He was there in
Really?
1953. This is
Right.
26 years later. The Iranian Revolution, and did the American embassy have to be taken over by Iranian radicals? The answer is actually no. February 1979, Iran's in chaos. The Shah, the American-backed autocrat, had gone into exile in mid-January, leaving behind a rickety Regency Council. On February 1st, the Grand Ayatollah Khomeini returned from exile in Paris. For 10 days, demonstrations took place until the Shah's government, totally collapsed on February 11th.
What happened to Muhammad?
To the Shah,
Yeah.
you'll find out in a minute. It's
Can I
coming.
interrupt for a minute?
Yeah. There is the first attack on the American embassy. The attack on the embassy occurs on the morning of February 14th in Tehran. The ambassador Sullivan surrendered the U.S. embassy and was able to resolve the crisis quickly after negotiations with the Iranian foreign minister. But nothing was done to close the Iranian embassy, reduce personnel, or strengthen its defenses. During the takeover, the embassy personnel failed to burn sensitive documents. Furnaces malfunctioned. They destroyed documents with cheaper paper shredders. In September, radical students began planning a more extensive assault on the embassy. This included daily demonstrations outside the U.S. Embassy to trigger an embassy response from security. This allowed organizers to assess the size and capability of the embassy's security force. There is Jimmy Carter, there is the Shah of Iran, and here comes the big problem. Jimmy Carter, against the advice of some of his advisors, decided to act in support of the Shah, declined to act in support of the Shah, but he does support him in a way. He also fails to reach out to his opposition. Carter doesn't know what to do. Well, do I denounce the Shah? Do I talk to Khomeini? He does neither. In October, after it was announced that the Shah, now in Mexico, was suffering from an aggressive form of cancer, Carter reluctantly decided to allow him to enter the United States for treatment on humanitarian grounds. And that is what sparks the demonstrations, the massive demonstrations in Iran. So the Shah flees, ends up in the United States. The Iranians who hate him begin to hate the United States even more. The Shah traveled to several countries before entering the United States in October for medical treatment of his cancer. In Tehran, Islamic militants responded on November 4th by storming the U.S. Embassy and taking the staff hostage. With the approval of Khomeini, the militants demanded the return of the Shah to Iran to stand trial for his crimes. The United States said, no, we're not going to negotiate. And that leads you to November 4th.
On what
This
grounds
storming.
did they say no?
Who, the Americans?
Yeah.
We just said no. Just said no.
That's it.
That's it. November 4th. At first, the students planned a symbolic occupation in which they would release statements to the press and leave when government security forces came to restore order. This was reflected in the posters saying, don't be afraid, we just want to sit in. When the embassy guards banished firearms, the protesters retreated. One told the Americans, we don't mean any harm. But as it became clear that the guards would not use deadly force, and that a large, angry crowd had gathered outside the compound to cheer the occupiers and jeer the hostages, the plan suddenly changed. Let's take the Americans hostage. And they did.
What did they hope to get from that?
They wanted the Americans gone. They just want them gone. Get out of our hair. We wanted them out. You've been interfering since 1953, 26 years.
Get the hell
We've
out.
had enough. Get out. Khomeini supported the takeover. He had issued a statement supporting the seizure, calling it the Second Revolution. And the embassy, he said, was American spy den in Tehran. The hostage takers declaring their solidarity with other oppressed minorities, and the special place of women in Islam released one woman and two African Americans on November 19. Kathy Gross and William Quarles praised the revolution's aims as part of their releases. 4 women and 6 American hostages were released the following day. There were now 52 hostages in total. The hostage taking was more about the Shah's medical care. They didn't care that the Americans, they didn't care that Shah was gone. They cared that the Americans decided to take care of the Shah medically, and that crossed the line. It was a ways for the student revolutionaries to declare a break with Iran's past and end American interference in its affairs. It was also a way to raise international profile of the new leader, the anti-American cleric Khomeini. The new Iran sets back the clock about 650 years. New rules were put into effect to forbid anything that may lead people astray and prevent them from ascending to a heavenly afterlife. There were strict controls on the media, which isolated Iranians from Western influence, an absolute segregation of the sexes in public places, compulsory headscarves for women, bans on alcohol, musical instruments on television, rules forbidding women to ride bicycles. Most of the people in here are women, so you would not be able to ride a bicycle in.
And women couldn't sing.
And women couldn't sing.
Public sing.
They couldn't sing. They
Because
couldn't
that was
sing.
too sexually.
Yeah, too sexually arousing.
Yes.
Jimmy Carter applied economic pressure by halting oil imports from Iran and freezing Iranian assets in the United States. That's an old gas pump in Hastings-on-the-Hudson. Those were the gas pumps circa the 1970s, and we have a gas crisis. One of the consequences of the Shah of Iran being overthrown was the Ayatollah Khomeini's decision to cut Iran's oil production, which reduced shipments of crude oil to the United States. Gasoline prices soared and soared and soared,
Here in America.
and the American economy would plunge into a recession, a major recession, in the late 1970s. And the threat of a gasoline shortage and rationing created long lines at the gas pumps.
Odd and even.
Odd and even, odd and even. Were you odd or were you even?
I don't remember.
You don't remember. I was
even.
I was even as well. OPEC, the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, decided to raise the price of crude oil by 14.49% in 4 steps during 1979, ending with a price freeze in effect since 1977. And that sends Jimmy Carter to the crossroads. What am I supposed to do? What am I supposed to do? What am I supposed to do? The Iranian crisis dominated the headlines and news broadcasts and made the Carter administration look weak and ineffectual. Carter's foreign policy team often seemed weak and vacillating. So you remember this song, Tie a Yellow Ribbon Round the Old Oak Tree? Well, somebody decided, who was related to one of the hostages, to tie a yellow ribbon around the old oak tree. Bruce Langan, a State Department Foreign Service officer, was a charge d'affaires in the U.S. Embassy in Tehran, and he was being held hostage. His wife, Penny, thought that the demonstrations of violence and anger, would not help the hostages' predicament, and told a reporter, "Tell them to do something constructive, because we need a great deal of patience. Just tell them to tie a yellow ribbon around the old oak tree." She was referring to the Tony Orlando and Dorn hit song of 1972. And people did. They tied a yellow ribbon around the old oak tree. Reagan's defeat of President Carter in the 1980 presidential election happened to fall on the one-year anniversary of the hostage-taking. Carter continued to negotiate for the hostages' release until the end of his term. Finally, on January 19th, in Algerian-mediated talks between the U.S. and Iran produced an agreement to end the crisis. Yes?
That was funny, just as the inauguration.
Yeah, they were released.
They were released.
They were released.
They said there was rumors that Reagan had something to do with the
Yeah,
behind
nothing.
the scenes
yeah.
negotiations.
Yeah, nothing ever officially substantiated. The Algiers Accords of January 19th committed Iran to free the hostages immediately essential to the Algiers Accords and was reportedly a non-negotiable requirement of Iran that the Carter administration conceded. No more intervention in Iranian affairs. It reads, the United States pledges that it is, and from now on, will be the policy of the United States to not intervene directly or indirectly, politically or militarily, in Iran's internal affairs.
Is this just for Iran or was it for any other?
This is just for Iran. Other provisions of the Algiers Accord were the unfreezing of $8 billion worth of Iranian assets and immunity from lawsuits that Iran might have faced. That would come back 20 years later when the hostages decided to sue and couldn't sue because of this agreement. On January 20th, two Air Force C-9 Nightingale Aerover aircrafts touched down at the Rhein-Main Air Force Base in Germany, West Germany, to cheering crowds. Inside, 52 Americans just released after 444 days of captivity in Iran, an event commonly referred to as the Iranian hostage crisis. And there they were in Newburgh, and I was somewhere behind that shrubbery there on the main street that goes through, I think it's Route 32, it might be 32, going through Newburgh. They were free, but before returning home to the United States, they stopped at an Air Force base in Wiesbaden, West Germany, West Germany, for medical and physical exams. Then it was off to Newburgh. And it's a cold winter's day, and they're inside somewhere. Looks like the bus, there was a photographer who was allowed in there, and that's what we saw, them waving to us with the yellow ribbons all around. In Iran, anti-Americanism became even stronger. Radicals were in stronger positions, and those accused of association with America were removed from the political picture. In America, gifts were showered upon the hostages as they returned, including lifetime passes to any major league or minor league baseball game. Reagan was shot. I was at Madison Square Garden the day he was shot. The New York Rangers were playing the Philadelphia Flyers, and that was my assignment that night. And there was a moment of prayer for Ronald Reagan, who was shot on March 30th, 1981, shot in the chest outside of a Washington, D.C. hotel by John Hinckley, Jr. The president had just finished addressing a labor meeting at the Washington Hilton Hotel and was walking with his entourage to a limousine when Hinckley, standing among a group of reporters, how he got there, that's a good question, fired 6 shots at the president, hitting Reagan and 3 of his attendants.
What happened to Hinckley?
We'll talk about him soon. There is Reagan after being shot. The White House press secretary, James Brady, was shot in the head, critically wounded. Secret Service agent Timothy McCarthy was shot in the side, and District of Columbia policeman Thomas Delahante was shot in the neck. After firing the shots, Hinckley was overpowered, pinned against the wall. Reagan, apparently unaware that he was shot, was shoved into the limousine by a Secret Service agent, rushed to the hospital. The assassination attempt, there's John Hinckley. Reagan was shot in the left lung, and the .22 caliber bullet just missed his heart. In an impressive feat for a 70-year-old man with a collapsed lung, he walked into the Washington University Hospital under his own power. He was treated and prepared for surgery. He's in good spirits and equipped to his wife Nancy, honey, I forgot to duck. And to his surgeons, please tell me you're Republicans. Reagan's surgery lasted for 2 hours. He was listed in stable condition and good condition afterwards. And he would go back to
How
work.
old was he about?
He was 70 years old. Reagan went back to the Capitol on April 28th to push for his Economic Recovery Tax Act and was greeted by a hero's welcome and a 3-minute standing ovation. He leveraged his political capital to help pass his agenda. Before the end of the summer, the Reagan tax cuts had passed. The House of Representatives, led by the Democrat from Massachusetts, the Speaker, Tip O'Neill, and the Republican-controlled Senate, and it reduced the top tax rates from 70% down and unleashed an entrepreneurial era.
How did that happen?
What, the tax cuts?
That this all.
Well, the House and the Senate negotiated the tax cuts that he
Yeah.
recommended.
How did this happen?
They passed it.
I realize it.
Yeah, negotiations, that's all. They negotiated the tax cuts. That was that. David Stockman, Reagan's budget director, acknowledged the promise of tax cuts for everyone was a Trojan horse to bring down the top rate for the richest. Do you realize the greed that came to the forefront? Stockman asked about the passage of Reagan's first tax bill. The hogs were really feeding. The greed level, the level of opportunism just got out of control. As far as John Hinckley, remember the actress Jodie Foster?
Yes.
He was smitten by her. And it had to do a little bit with the movie Taxi Driver, Robert De Niro. And by the way, I'm going to put a plug in for my family. I'm related to Stella Adler, who had the acting school.
Right?
And among her students was Robert De Niro.
Yes.
Did she get free tickets at least?
I don't know. You got to ask her grandson, Tom Oppenheimer. Tom Oppenheimer now runs the studio. After seeing the 1976 film Taxi Driver, Hinckley began to identify with the main character, the Robert De Niro character, who plots to assassinate a presidential candidate. Hinckley became fixated on Jodie Foster, who played a child prostitute in the movie, and moved to New Haven, Connecticut to be close to her when she started to attend Yale University. After the 1980 election, Hinckley stalked President Reagan in an attempt to impress Foster. In 1981, he wrote a letter to Foster describing his plan to kill the president, waited outside the Washington Hilton Hotel for Reagan, waving at him as he went inside to deliver a speech. And there's John Hinckley. In 1982, a jury found Hinckley not guilty by reason of insanity. He was sent to St. Elizabeth's, a psychiatric hospital in Washington, and was confined. Union busted. The Petco Union is busted by Reagan in 1981. And before that, there was the Major League Baseball strike, 1981. That is Marvin Miller, who I got to know very well a few years afterwards. Marvin Miller was part of the Steelworkers Union back in the 1950s, 1960s, and put together the Baseball Players Association. With him is Ray Grebe, who is the guy who is the negotiator for Major League Baseball. The seeds of the 1981 strike, Major League Baseball players struck in the final days of spring training in 1980, forcing the cancellation of 92 games. The sides agreed in May of 1980 to a 4-year contract that allowed the issue of compensation to be reopened in 1981. The players struck on June 12th, the first mid-season stoppage in sports history. They don't reach an agreement until July 31st. Team compensation from losing a player because of free agency would come from a pool of players, not the team signing a free agent. Players went on strike June 12th to protest the demand by the owners for a compensation system to accommodate teams that lost a free agent. They did not play another game until August the 9th. 59 days of games were lost. After reaching an agreement, the players had just 8 days of training before the first matchup, the All-Star game in Cleveland on August 9th, and they would play a split season. The owners settled with the players on the morning of July 31st. Why did they settle on with the players on July 31st? Their strike insurance ran out. Hey, we're not losing any money. Another union that was busted was PATCO. February, new contract negotiations opened between PATCO and the Federal Aviation Administration, which employed air traffic controllers. Citing safety concerns, PATCO calls for a reduced 32-hour work week, $10,000 pay increase for all air traffic controllers, and better benefits package for retirement. The contract negotiations with the FAA stall. There's a conservative wave in the Western world. Margaret Thatcher, the UK Prime Minister. Thatcher took over as the UK Prime Minister in 1979, promising to curb the power of unions, which had shown their ability to bring the country to a standstill during 6 weeks of strikes in the winter of 1978-79. Her government enacted a series of measures designed to undermine the union's ability to organize and stage strikes, including laws that banned closed shop, required unions to poll their members before ordering a strike, forbade sympathy strikes, rendered unions responsible for damages caused by their members. Thatcher advocated greater independence of an individual from a state and to allegedly excessive government interference in the economy, including privatization of state-owned enterprises and the sale of public housing to tenants, reductions in expenditures on social services such as healthcare, spend less on healthcare, education, housing, limit education, limit public housing, limitations on the printing of money in accord to the economic doctrine of monetarism, and legal restrictions on trade unions. Thatcher and Ronald Reagan were kindred souls. Thatcher, in 1971, inheriting a weak economy, she reduced or eliminated some government regulations and subsidies to businesses, thereby purging the manufacturing industry of many inefficient but also blameless firms. The result was a dramatic increase in employment in the UK from 1.3 million to more than double that figure 2 years later. At the same time, inflation doubled in just 14 months to more than 20%, and manufacturing output fell sharply. Well, she kind of ruined the economy and was in bad shape, but she imported that or exported that to the United States. Thatcher embarked on an ambitious program of privatization of state-owned industries, public services, including aerospace, television, radio, gas, electricity, water, the state airline, and British Steel. Rising unemployment and social tensions during her first term made her deeply unpopular, but they were political soulmates. In foreign affairs, her most significant international relationship was with Ronald Reagan. Thatcher and Reagan shared a vision of the world in which the Soviet Union was an evil empire, evil enemy, deserving of no compromise, and their partnership ensured that the Cold War would continue. So, here are the PATCO workers. August 3rd, about 13,000 PATCO members go out on strike after unsuccessful contract negotiations. In doing so, the union technically violated the 1955 law that banned strikes by government unions. Reagan declares the PATCO strike a peril to national safety and orders the controllers back to work. The union, they did it. The union was busted. August 5th, most striking air traffic controllers are fired. Reagan bans them from ever being rehired by the FAA. They are initially replaced by controllers, supervisors, and staff personnel not participating in the strike, and in some cases, military controllers. August 17th, the FAA begins accepting applications for new air traffic controllers. October 22nd, the Federal Labor Relations Authority decertifies PATCO. Later, new air traffic controllers hired in the wake of the strike organized a new union to represent them, the National Air Traffic Controllers Association. Reagan was able to send out a message to union employees. The old rules are gone. There's a new sheriff in town. You're not going to get what you want. Also, at this time, the superstar CEO The guy who's the head of the company becomes well known and becomes a star. His name is Jack Welch. He is the head of General Electric, and he has a rather unique style about him. I'm not keeping all of my workers. Some of them are going to be fired, just to show you who's in charge. Jack Welch became one of the nation's most well-known and highly regarded corporate leaders during his 2 decades as GE's chairman and chief executive from 1981 to 2001. He personified the so-called cult of the CEO during the late 1990s boom when GE's soaring stock price made it the most valuable company in the world, except it tumbled eventually, and Jack Welch became a laughingstock. GE took over NBC in 1981, and Jack Welch, because he now owned NBC TV, NBC Radio, and I was an employee of NBC Radio at one point during his reign, became a media darling. Welch made deep payroll cuts long before the term downsizing became commonplace. He instituted the kind of internal competition between GE workers, which applied mainly to GE managers. It became known as rank and yank. Top performers got bonuses and stock options. The bottom 10% was fired. This was going on every year. Fire the bottom 10%.
And they allowed this?
And it happened. It's a private company. It happened. Anwar Sadat is assassinated. It's October 6th. Assassins posing as soldiers opened fire on the Egyptian president as he watched the military victory parade to mark Egypt's 1973 war with Israel. Sadat launched a surprise war back in 1973, and he figured that was the only way he was getting Israel to the negotiating table. So start the war, hurt them a little bit, they'll negotiate with us. That is what happens. He made peace several years later, shocking even some of his closest associates by traveling to Jerusalem in 1975-76 to address the Israeli Knesset in person. Sadat strengthened economic and political relationships with the United States, turned away from his predecessor's close ties, President Nasser, to the Soviet Union. Sadat, along with the Israeli Prime Minister Menachem Begin, won the 1972 Nobel Peace Prize for the Camp David Accords. But he is assassinated. The assassins waited for the right moment to kill Sadat. They waited for the military parade to pass in front of Sadat's presidential viewing stand. There were thousands of soldiers watching, taking part in the parade, but very few of them were armed. As the gunmen passed in front of Sadat, they opened fire. The Israeli-Egyptian peace treaty was rejected by many in the Arab world, including the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt, and that led to the formation of Al-Qaeda, which felt that the president had abandoned efforts to ensure a Palestinian state. Sadat's refusal to consult with other Arab nations before making a separate peace with Israel resulted in Egypt being suspended from the Arab League. Tensions increased within Egypt as Islamists called for the overthrow of the president, and the country was marked by riots. Sadat ordered a major crackdown of opposition leaders after a failed military coup in June of 1981. Hosni Mubarak becomes the new leader. He's to Sadat's right, your left. Sadat and 11 others were killed outright or suffered fatal wounds. 28 were wounded, including Mubarak and 4 U.S. military liaison officers. Security forces were momentarily stunned but reacted within 45 seconds. One of the attackers was killed, 3 others injured and arrested. The assassins were tried, found guilty, sentenced to death, executed by firing squad April 1982, and Mubarak was sworn in as president on October 14th. Poland has martial law. The military leaders of Poland, well, we'll tell you in a second. The military leaders of Poland declared a state of emergency and placed the nation under martial law in December. The leaders of the Solidarity Union, trade union, had been making progress in what was described as a peaceful revolution up to that point. Then they were arrested. The Polish government claimed that the crackdown was necessary to prevent a civil war, but it was more than likely used as a means to crush the political opposition coming from the Solidarity movement. Pope John Paul II was shot. He was shot on May the 13th by Mehmet Ali Aksa. The Pope survived the attack, but sustained gunshot wounds to his left hand, right arm, and abdomen. Aksa's motive for the attempted assassination was unknown. He was sentenced in July to life imprisonment in Italy for the assassination attempt. He ended up in jail. AIDS. We need research. We need research. On June the 5th, the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention newsletter, Morbidity and Mortality Weekly, makes a reference to 5 cases of an unusual form of pneumonia in Los Angeles. July 3rd, rare cancer is seen in 41 homosexuals. The CDC's MMWR publishes the first description of an outbreak of 41 cases of Kaposi's sarcoma, a rare skin disease. December 10th, researchers report in the New England Journal of Medicine that harmless virus and bacteria can often cause fatal diseases in homosexual men. By the end of 1981, there are 121 deaths from AIDS.
By the way, it's Kaposi's sarcoma.
I'm sorry.
There's no R.
Okay, I'm sorry. Okay. And there's Time Magazine, Growing Threat, What's to be done? Sandra Day O'Connor becomes the first woman Supreme Court Justice. Reagan nominates her on July the 7th. The confirmation hearing was held at the beginning of September, and by the end of the month, the Senate voted 99-0. You're the one. One senator was absent. She became the first female justice of the Supreme Court of the United States officially on September 25th. The Columbia Space Shuttle is launched, the first space shuttle mission, on April the 12th. It is commanded by Robert Crittman and a veteran astronaut, John Young, and it's the first of the series of spacecrafts of the Space Shuttle program. The purpose of the mission was to test the stability of the new spacecraft and safely launch the vehicle into space, return it to Earth, so the craft was reusable. The total length of the mission, 2 days, 6 hours, 20 minutes, 53 seconds. How many of you enjoyed this movie? The Raiders of the Lost Ark. Enjoyed the movie? Harrison Ford, right? Indiana Jones. Indiana Jones is the classic hero of this adventure, set in the 1930s, as the quick-witted and handy he's an archaeologist. Goes on the hunt for the lost Ark of the Covenant, often facing insurmountable odds. Indy always finds ways to manages to succeed in the nick of time, joined by enduring companions and opposed by notorious villains. The film was a collaboration between George Lucas and Steven Spielberg. Raiders of the Lost Ark was the highest-grossing film of 1981. It took in $330.5 million worldwide and won 5 Academy Awards. I am not a big fan of the royal family. I'm just going to get that out there. I'm not a big fan of the royal family. But tourist-wise, it's a big business in England, particularly in London. And Charles and Diana get married, and she becomes the people's princess and all that other stuff. And I'm not into that stuff. I'm really not into it.
Give a gift.
But I ignored it. So, but people did. It's important to people, particularly in the United States, for whatever reason. The wedding of Lady Diana Spencer and Prince Charles took place on July 29th. They tied the knot at St. Paul's Cathedral, and the ceremony was a traditional Church of England wedding. It was estimated to be seen globally by 750 million people, which means 1 in every 6 or 7 people saw them get married. It's a big deal, and in the UK it was a national holiday.
Did they give
Um,
gifts?
Excuse me?
Did they give gifts?
I have no idea. I was more interested in this guy, Muhammad Ali. And that's me and Muhammad Ali in 1985. He was a fascinating character. He was a boxer, humanitarian. He was an entertainer. First and foremost, he was an entertainer. By the time I met him in 1975, and this picture caught him off guard a little bit, I think, he had the full effects of Parkinson's disease. He couldn't really speak anymore. He retired with a career record of 55 wins, 5 defeats. He was outspoken on issues of race, religion, and politics. He was a controversial figure during his career. It's always real nice to me. One of my best friends, Shelley Saltman, was one of his promoters, and he said Cassius Clay, Muhammad Ali, was the real thing. He said he was honest, and the rest of the stuff was showbiz. Born Cassius Clay Jr., Ali changed his name in 1964 after joining the Nation of Islam, which made him a really scary character. Citing his religious beliefs, he was refused induction on he refused induction in military service on April 30th, 1967 in Houston, Texas. He was stripped of his heavyweight championship, banned from boxing for 3 years during the prime of his career. Parkinson's syndrome severely impacted Ali's motor skills and speech. He was hit an estimated 60,000 times in the head. I want my MTV! I want my MTV! August 1st, MTV, music television, goes on air for the first time ever with the words spoken by one of MTV's creators, John Lack. Ladies and gentlemen, rock and roll the Bugles. Video killed the radio star. That was the first music video on the air on this new cable channel, which was only available in parts of New Jersey. These two islands become a country, Antigua and Barbuda. By the way, if you ever have a heart attack on Antigua, don't. There are no coronary units on Antigua. They airlift you somewhere else. I learned that on a cruise ship when I was speaking on cruise ships. Antigua and Barbuda became an independent state within the Commonwealth of Nations on November 1st. Antigua is one of the Caribbean's most prosperous nations, although if you walk through it, you would never think it, thanks to the tourism industry and offshore financial services. The legacy, that is Ben Barnes.
Who's Ben Barnes?
Well, I will tell you who Ben Barnes is because he recently surfaced. In March 2023, a retired political operative from Texas by the name of Ben Barnes revealed a secret he kept for nearly 43 years. Texas Governor John Connally took him to one Middle Eastern capital after another in the summer of 1980, where he met with a host of regional leaders to deliver a blunt message to be passed to Iran. Don't release the hostages before the election. Ronald Reagan will win and give you a better deal. That's what he said. Where's the proof? The United States and Iran have maintained a generally hostile relationship between now and then, since the 1979 Iranian Revolution.
Still
Reagan survived an assassination attempt, won re-election in 1984. July 27th, 2016, a federal judge ruled that John Hinckley could be released from St. Elizabeth's on August 5th. He was no longer considered a threat to himself or others. On September 27, 2021, a federal judge approved Hinckley for unconditional release beginning June 2022. He was officially released not only from St. Elizabeth, but from his criminal record on June 15, 2022. Excerpt, who shot John Paul II, was released on parole January 12, 2006. Thatcher would survive low approval ratings, rebound to win another term in the general election in the UK in 1983 because of two factors. The Falkland Islands War of 1982 between Britain and Argentina over possessions of remote British dependency in the South Atlantic, and deep divisions within the Labor Party. Major League Baseball would have strikes in 1985, a lockout in 1990, season-ending strike in 1994. On August 23rd, 1993, President Bill Clinton lifted the ban on hiring air traffic controllers fired by Ronald Reagan when they joined an illegal strike 22 years later. Mubarak was president of Egypt for 30 years, from 1981 through 2011. Then he was ousted by the Egyptian military. Lech Walesa, who was a Solidarity leader, became Poland's president between 1990 and 1995. The Space Shuttle Columbia disaster took place on February 1st, 2003, when the Space Shuttle Columbia disintegrated as it re-entered the atmosphere, killing 7 crew members. Sandra Day O'Connor retired from the court on January 1st, 2006. Part of her reason for retiring was to spend more time with her husband, John J. O'Connor. In 1999, the United States Library of Congress selected Raiders of the Lost Ark to be preserved in the National Film Registry for being culturally, historically, and aesthetically significant. For its 40th anniversary in 2021, the film was released in a remastered 4K resolution Ultra HD Blu-ray based film, or DVD, based on the original film negative. Charles and Diana split in 1992, finalized their divorce in 1996. Diana died in a car crash August 31st, 1997. Charles became the King of England following the death of his mother, Queen Elizabeth II, on September 8, 2022. MTV is no longer an exclusive music channel. AIDS, the existence of HIV was discovered to be cause of AIDS in 1981. In September, 1984, correct. In September, the Internet Engineering Task Force published RFC 791. The RFC document formally defined the IPv4, the fundamental communications protocol used by most of the modern Internet. The first frequent flyer miles, AA, American Airlines Advantage, was introduced by American Airlines. There is me, and it's Don Fear, who's the head of the Baseball Players Association. The baseball strike in 1995, settled by the judge, Sotomayor, who went on to be, I'm right behind him with the red jacket, who went on to be a United States Supreme Court Justice, who happens to share the same hairdresser as my wife does down on Lafayette Street in Lower Manhattan. And she's there one day and I'm there and say, hey, Justice, remember me from 1995? I was in your courtroom and we spoke for about an hour and a half. Major League Baseball began its decline in popularity with the 1991 strike. More work stoppages would follow in the ensuing years, including the 1994 players' strike that would cancel that year's World Series. And that is it. That is my life story, or part of my life story. Any questions, any comments? It's your turn to tell your life story.
What do you have left to tell?
What do I have left to tell? A lot.